And let's read this. And you know, the thing about the Sabbath, I don't know where you all are coming from, actually. I mean, it's kind of interesting because most of the time you kind of have an idea, but I don't know where anyone's coming from. But I know for us, we've wrestled through this in our journey as Reformed believers. And, you know, you start out usually how cultural Christianity starts out, which is basically like, it's just another day. I mean, we go to church, we don't know why, it's Sunday, and that's just how it's always been done. And so you do it, and you kind of follow the trend, and you go along with it. But then, you know, and I think we've all at least been to this place where you start to realize, you know, there's the moral law, the Ten Commandments, it comes from God's nature. It's very important. We all realize that, you know, we shouldn't murder, we shouldn't commit adultery, we shouldn't steal. Every one of these commandments are beautiful. They're binding. But, of course, when it comes to the fourth commandment, it's kind of just out in its own land. And so what happened for me is I started studying the London Baptist Confession of Faith, and then through that, you know, like we'll actually bring up today the Westminster Larger Catechism. But there's an idea there because they come in this place from the same angle. But there is an idea that this day is a special day. It's a very special day, and it's different than everything else. And hopefully, by God's grace, we'll see why. So let's start in verse 8. So chapter 20, verse 8. Okay, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. Verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And this is by far the longest description of any of the commandments that God gives when you're talking about the moral law. 12 through 16, honor your father and mother that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. 13, you shall not murder. 14, you shall not commit adultery. 15, you shall not steal. And you see how it's just bang, bang, bang. But when it comes to the Sabbath, there's a description there. There's an explanation there. And so what I want to do is I want to start out by giving you the 5 views that are typically considered, I wouldn't say necessarily orthodox, but they are 5 views that Reformed people hold to. And I'm going to give you those views from the least to the most restrictive. Okay? So the least restrictive view is that the Sabbath is not a holy day, but it is an appropriate day for worship, basically because that's the way it's always been done. It's not a 24-hour period distinct from any other day. D.A. Carson holds to that view, and I think Meredith Kline in his later years holds to something like that. So I'm giving you the broad stroke. You know, there will be nuances and subtleties under each one, but in general, that's what they're looking at. So it's not a holy day. It's an appropriate day for worship. Yes, it's not a 24-hour period. Number 2, it's a stated day, not necessarily Sunday. Okay, it could be Monday, it could be Tuesday. However, Sunday is the best day because it's what the church has done traditionally. So it is a good day for it. Sunday is a good day for that. It's a day for spiritual rest. It's a day for to rest from your physical toil, to rest from your entertainment. But the emphasis here is on the worship and not the rest. Okay, it's on the worship and not the rest. So you want to come together at some point during the week to worship, right? And this view is actually held by Calvin and the Heidelberg Catechism is more or less in this direction. Okay, so you can see, I mean, these guys are not, you know, Tim Keller's, right? I mean, this is Calvin. So the third view, from the least to most restrictive, the Synod of Dort, they stated that Sunday is a holy day. It's set apart for worship, pious reflection, to put away recreations that hinder worship. But the emphasis again is on worship. That we have a holy obligation to worship and eliminate anything that distracts from our worship. That's why we rest enough. We rest so that our worship is better. But the emphasis is on rest. So those 3 views, they're putting the emphasis on on worship and not rest, right? The next 2 views, I'll put it this way because I'm saving the Westminster for the last. But the 4th view is that rest is the most important element of the Sabbath, not the worship. So worship is important, is part of the Sabbath, but they put the emphasis on rest. John Frame and the early Klein, they hold to that view. A lot of Reformed people, they'll hold to this kind of emphasis on rest. And they're saying that because the Sabbath literally means that the Hebrew word for rest is Shabbat. Okay, which means that's where we get the word Sabbath. So if you're thinking about in Genesis 1, Genesis in the garden, where it says that God rested, He literally Sabbathed. God Sabbathed. Right? So that's why they're looking at it and they're saying, to Sabbath is to cease, to desist, to rest, and that's why they're putting the emphasis on rest. And in Exodus 20, we're seeing that too. There's an emphasis here that is saying that we look at verse 10, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God, in it you shall do no work. Right? So there's that emphasis there. It's a day for public and private worship, yes. But the idea is you don't want to do anything laborious, anything that's out of the norm. So here's the thing. The fifth view, when you get to the Westminster, and of course through that the London Baptist Confession, they put the emphasis on rest and on worship. So they're actually the most, I guess you would say the strictest view of all the views of the Sabbath. They were very notorious Sabbatarians. These English Puritans, the Scottish Presbyterians, they were, where the Westminster comes from, even the London Baptist, they were strict Sabbatarians. Right? And so that's why it's important to go over this. And I'm saying this, see, my point is I think there is room for Christian liberty here. And we'll see that as far as the details of it, as far as how you act that out and live that out. But there is the idea and the reality that this has always been a special day. And we have to figure out why that is, right? And that's the main point, okay, so we can better glorify God. And here's the thing, this is a very practical topic because this day comes up every single week. So we've got to figure out what's the best thing to do with the day. Because it comes at us every week. It's not something that happens like once every 6 months or every year. This happens every week, right? So let's try to figure this out, okay? So look at verse 8. Verse 8, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Now, here's one of the things about the Sabbath, right? And I think it's important that it does come up every week. It's something that we have to remember to do. And I think this is why God goes in among other reasons, He goes into great length to explain what it is. Because I think our tendency in the flesh is to trend towards forgetting that this is a special day. Forgetting that this is a day to set apart. And that's, I think, our natural element. As far as our flesh still fights against this idea that the entire day is to be set apart for the Lord, right? And so remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Don't forget that it's the Sabbath day, right? But also, this is the first reason, and this changed pretty much everything for me as far as my view of the Sabbath goes. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 5, go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. So there's three reasons that God gives as far as why we should still today hold to and keep the Christian Sabbath. The first reason that I'm going to point out here is, look at verse 12, chapter 5, Deuteronomy, verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you, so that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. Now, we've read that basically just now in Exodus 20. Verse 15, though, changes. It changes. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. In other words, it's a day to remember what the Lord has done for us. Right? It's not just for the Israelites. This is a day, because, in a sense, we were all brought out of Egypt as Christians. We were taken from Egypt. The Scriptures use that as an illustration all the time. If we're Christians today, we've been delivered from our bondage. We've been delivered from the chains of slavery, from the chains of the world's dominion over us. We've been delivered from that. So the Sabbath is a day where we remember what the Lord has done, how He's brought us out of that. So that's the first thing. That's the first reason why this is not something just for the Israelites. It's not just something for the Old Testament people. This is something that all of us as Christians should be able to relate to. God has brought us out of slavery, right? So going back to Exodus 20, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And holy, the very word of holy means to be set apart. When the Bible calls God holy, a lot of times we think of holy as moral purity, moral integrity, and that's part of the meaning of it, but the ideal meaning is that it's set apart. It's different. It's not like everything else. So that's where we're getting with the Sabbath. It's something that's different. It's a day of rest. That's literally what Sabbath means, like we saw. But look at verse 9. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, right? And so here's something else, and I'm sure you're aware that, you know, the beauty of this is that, okay, think about the Israelites and where they're coming from. Do you think while the Israelites were in slavery, right, in Egypt, do you think that they had a day of rest ever? Did you think that, you know, the Pharaoh, he came in and said, hey, I feel so bad for you guys, I'm going to give you that 7th day so you can just rest? Of course not, right? So this is, in a sense, it's new, not in the sense that it's the first time that it's been done, because God gave this command, we'll see this in a minute in the garden, but it's new in the sense of, for generations, they have never kept this day of rest. And I think it's hard for us as people who are living in a culture where, you know, I mean, the Sabbath, obviously not a lot of people are holding the Sabbath or observing the Sabbath, but there's still the idea that, hey, I at least get 6 days of work, and then I get 1 day at least, usually 2 days to actually rest. So even for us, though, living in that culture, it's still hard to set this day apart and just worship the Lord with it, right? I mean, even this morning, it was almost like the Lord just ordained it. You know, the guy next door is mowing his yard. We're coming over here. People are like playing volleyball. And that's just the culture we live in, right? This is a pagan culture. But the thing about Christianity is the reason why we have this idea of 5 days or 6 days of work and resting on the 7th is because of Christianity. It was a Christian worldview that brought the idea that you deserve a day of rest. Now, obviously, we would rephrase that. We wouldn't say you deserve a day of rest, right? But our culture today, for some reason, they wouldn't be able to explain it. Why do you, when you go to your boss, why do you say, hey, I only want to work 40 hours a week, and I only want to work 5 days a week, at most 6 days a week? Well, the boss technically could say, well, no, you don't get that. I guess you couldn't because of the laws, right? But those laws come from Christianity. It's Christianity that is God, is Yahweh, that actually came in and said, look, you have a day of rest, right? And of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you can just do whatever you want, right? It's the Lord's day. But the idea does come from God. And so you can see that the Israelites, I don't know about y'all, but I have a hard time just ceasing and desisting on any day, right? And just put it, I have a hard time doing that. But you can imagine how much more difficult it would be for the Israelites coming out of slavery, where they're used to working all the time. I mean, it's just in them probably to do things, right? So the Lord that's another reason why I think the Lord is explaining, going into such length here. But the point here is that 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. We do have the mandate from God to work, right? So that's the other thing. So here it is, and that's something that, of course, the Reformers brought back and say, listen, we can work for the glory of God. It doesn't matter if you're a plumber, doesn't matter if you're a wife with a son. I mean, when you're working, you do it for the glory of God, even if it's just the most despicable job anyone has in the universe. You can do that job for the glory of God, right? So 6 days we are called to labor. We are called to do all our work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. And what's interesting about verse 10 is that, see, verse 10 is showing that it's not just, it's basically anybody in your house. So in other words, if you had visitors, right? We have some visitors or something, and Sunday comes along. Well, it's saying right here, the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. Anybody in your house, right? We're responsible that if they're under our roof, they are following the Lord's day. They are following the Sabbath. They are going to observe the Sabbath. And that's on us, especially the males in the house. But look, here's what I also want to capture, because this is the second reason why the Sabbath is still binding. So we saw the first is because it's a day to remember what the Lord's done for us to bring us out of Egypt. The second, though, verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. This is a creation ordinance. This is something that did not originate at Mount Sinai. In fact, check out Exodus 16. Before the 10 Commandments are even given, look at verse 22. They actually observed the Sabbath before there was a commandment, the 4th commandment telling them to observe the Sabbath. Verse 22, now on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then he said to them, this is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning. And pick up the details here as far as the practicalities of, okay, what should I do and what should I not do on the Sabbath? And we'll talk about this last, because the details is kind of where it breaks down as far as, okay, well, what does it mean to actually keep the Sabbath, right? I mean, okay, sounds good, but, I mean, what do I have to do? So, I mean, you see some things here that you can apply as far as putting things away on Sunday. Do everything you can, before Sunday. Now, obviously, we'll talk about exceptions here in a minute, but to the extent that you're able to, that's what we should be doing. Verse 24, so they put it aside until morning, as Moses had ordered, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. And, of course, there were people who actually, what did they do? They went and they took too much and it spoiled and things like that. But the point is this, okay? The Sabbath is something that began in the garden. Right? And so if you go to Genesis 1 through 3, and I don't think we need to, there's three things that are important to note, though. There's a creation ordinance. In other words, okay, so what are some creation ordinances? Well, be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth, right? These are things that are still binding. In other words, image bearers of God. Here's the thing. The fact that we are image bearers of God, what it means to be made in God's image, we're called to be representatives of God on earth. We're called to be stewards of God on earth. So if God is the one who's following this 6 days of work plus 1 day of rest, now of course God never ceases, He never desists. When it talks about God resting, it's more like God is taking delight in His own glory through what He has made. He's enjoying what He's done. He's enjoying it. It's not like He just stops and, we know that, right? But when it comes to us, God has given us this pattern in the garden of 6 days where we work, 1 day of rest. That's why He's given us that pattern. In fact, that's why Calvin, and I think he's exactly right when he's talking about the age of the earth. And he could have, is 6 days? Could that be like 20 billion years or 4 billion years or what? And he says, of course not, because God has given us this pattern for us to follow. God could God have done that 20 or 4.5 billion years? Calvin would say, well, I'm not even going to answer that. The reality is He didn't. He told us it's 6 days. He did everything in 6 days. He's not a liar. He's not a fabricator. He's not stretching the truth. It's 6 days, and one of the purposes of doing that was to be a pattern for us to follow. We work 6 days. We rest on the seventh. It's just like any other creation ordinance. It's still binding today. Nobody here is going to say, marriage is a creation ordinance. Nobody here is going to say, well, we're going to put aside marriage. We're going to put aside subduing the earth. We're going to put aside working because it was creation. No, it's the other way around, right? Same thing with the Sabbath, okay? And here's the other thing, last thing on the creation ordinance. This was given to Adam pre-fall. And so if Adam needed this day of rest, and what would Adam have been doing? Most theologians say, he would be like what we're doing. We're resting physically, but we're also worshiping God. We're also enjoying God as creation. We're enjoying His attributes through what He's made and things like that. So Adam would have been doing that pre-fall. So if Adam needed that day pre-fall, how much more do we need that day post-fall? To actually just stop and enjoy it. And remember what Christ says, and this is getting a little ahead of what I was going to say, but Christ says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And this is what that means in a sense. We need the Sabbath because we need to stop and pause and ponder and reflect on God and who He is and what He's brought us from and worship God and be with believers and hear the Word of God being preached. We need the Sabbath. It was made for us. It was made for us to benefit from, right? And of course, you can load that down. I was reading something about the Pharisees. Jesus, a lot of times when He's talking to the Pharisees and He's talking about how they load people down with burdens too hard to bear. And there was something like 1,500 laws that the Pharisees and Sadducees in their book actually came up with. So and that's where you see where they're upset with Jesus for His disciples picking some wheat and they eat the wheat. And that's where but see, Christ, what He's doing is He's flipping the tables and He's saying, you guys are making the Sabbath this very undelightful thing. Because it's all about rules, right? And so there is a sense in which you can become legalistic. However, the purpose of Christ is that He's Lord of the Sabbath, which tells us it's still binding. because he's still Lord in the Sabbath. He doesn't say he's Lord of the Sabbath that used to be. He's Lord of the Sabbath today. But the Sabbath was made for man, so it's something for us to delight in. It's something for us to benefit from, because it draws us near to God if done properly. So, verse 11, so it's a creation ordinance in 6 days, okay? And notice too, the very last part of verse 11, where it's talking about the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and the Lord made it holy. Okay, so this is something we're seeing. Okay, so it's a day, it's a 24-hour day. It's not a half day. It says it's a day. It's set apart. It's holy. We have 3 reasons why it should still be kept today. It's a creation ordinance. It's a day of remembrance. Thirdly, I didn't mention this, but the moral law is itself still binding today, because it comes from God's nature. It's not something that ceases. The moral law. So there's the third reason. But here's the thing. Here's the real situation that we're dealing with, I think, when it comes to our lives, is how do we follow this out, right? If we love God, and I believe we all do here, and we're saying, okay, I want to do this right, but what do I do? What does that mean, right? And so, fortunately, we have hundreds of years of people actually exploring this and trying to figure that out. Two things to note here before we actually go into the particulars of this is there are exceptions, right? There are exceptions to this rule of the Sabbath. Okay, so the exceptions would be, number one, what's called works of necessity. So in other words, works of necessity would be, Christ gives us the example again, disciples picking heads of grain to eat. So if you're hungry and clearly we have to do something in the kitchen to eat some food, right? And otherwise what? Well, we're going to starve, right? So that's a work of necessity. You do have to eat. Also, Christ recognizes that there are, like priests, for instance, they had to arrange for the worship. They had to work on the Sabbath, because they were arranging for worship. They were doing things like that. So that would be an exception when you're doing things for the household of God to serve the Lord in some capacity. But also think about certain jobs, for instance, like doctors. If an emergency took place and you go to the hospital and it's shut down because it's Sunday, you might die, literally, right? So jobs, certain jobs out there, police officers, doctors, firefighters, even farmers. Tasha's dad, they have a dairy in Clovis, and those cows have to be milked twice every single day. I don't know what would happen if they didn't, but it sounds like it's a necessity that they are milked every single day. Not just for profit either. I mean, they have to be milked, right? And I will say this. So I've heard it both ways as far as, okay, what if I have a job and the only way I can keep this job is if I work on Sundays? And I'm not talking about a firefighter or a police officer. I'm talking about, let's say Burger King, right? And they're saying, listen, if you don't work on Sundays, in fact, we had some guys over the other night, and they wanted to apply at HEB, and on the HEB application form, they said, we're not going to work on Sundays, and they were assuming that because of that, they don't get the job, right? So I have heard this, though. I've heard some people say, I've heard it go both ways, as far as, there will be times when your job, they're going to require you to work on Sundays. And if it's a situation where you can't get out of it and you'll lose your job, or bad consequences if you if you don't work, then that would fall under a work of necessity, right? I was studying another guy yesterday, and he was saying the opposite. He was saying no, and he makes a good point, because he acknowledges that how many Christians, like the guys, let's say that I'm talking about with the HEB, how many Christians have given up their jobs because those jobs require them to work on Sunday, right? And so I think some of this breaks down into saying, listen, there is a Christian liberty as far as what your conscience tells you to do. I would say that some of this falls under that, because I think it's a matter of your conscience, being honest with your conscience and trying to figure out, okay, is this of the Lord? Is this a work of necessity, or is this just me breaking the Sabbath, right? So, but then the second exception would be what's called a work of mercy, and that's where Christ is healing people. Mark 3:3 is healing people. A lot of times, actually, most of Christ's healings are done on the Sabbath. And he's making a point here, right? Because of all those rules and regulations that the Pharisees, Sadducees had kept on the Sabbath, he's coming in and deliberately healing on the Sabbath to show them this is made for man. The Sabbath is made for man. Doing good for people on the Sabbath is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. So that would be another exception, okay? Now, practically, as far as there's two ways I think that are good to look at as far as, okay, what should I do on the Sabbath? What should I not do on the Sabbath? I would say those are the two ways to break this down. So what should I do on the Sabbath, and what should I not do on the Sabbath? Okay, and to look at this, I'm going to use the Westminster Confession of Faith and the larger catechism from the Westminster. And this is something I think we would all agree with. It's not even, I don't think, a debate, right? As far as what should we do? Well, public worship, the gathering of the saints, hearing the word preached, praying, breaking bread together if possible, and then private worship. You know, when you're not at church, still spending time reading the word, praying. The Puritans called the Sabbath, and I love this, they called the Sabbath a market day for the soul. The 6 days during the week, you know, when you go to the market, you're gathering stuff, you're getting bread, you're getting, you know, toast or bread, cheese, all the milk, all those things that you need, right? So you're going and you're getting things for your sustenance. Well, they called the Sabbath the market day for the soul, because that's your day where you're basically restoring your soul, you're getting reinvigorated, you're being rejuvenated, and so you're feeding on things that are going to feed your soul, to help your soul, right? The marketplace of the soul. Public worship, private worship. Now those are positive injunctions. Negative injunctions in the sense of what you should not be doing: resting from physical work. So physical work, we should rest from physical work. We should rest, and this is where the Puritans, you know, okay, I'm just going to read this, because sometimes that's easier. Otherwise, you know, they're saying, well, you're a legalist. So I'll just read what they said, and then, you know, you get mad at them, but we'll say that we hold to this, and we'll go from there, right? Okay, so chapter 21, this is where it is, chapter 21. And they have all the verses listed under this. Chapter 21, number 8. Let's start in number 8, because I think it is more practical. This Sabbath is then kept holy unto the Lord, when men, after a due preparing of their hearts, so that's important, right? You want to prepare for the Sabbath. In fact, in the old days, they would actually start Saturday night before the Sabbath. Preparing of their hearts and ordering of their common affairs beforehand, so preparing everything so you don't have to mess with it on Sunday. Do not only observe a holy rest all the day from their own works, words, and thoughts. Now this is where the Puritans, this is again, I mean, they were strict Sabbatarians, about their worldly employments and recreations. So in other words, a holy rest all the day from their own works, words, and thoughts. So even, and this is why it's beautiful, because it's not really a legalistic thing, because you don't know my thoughts, right? That's between me and the Lord. So you can't control those thoughts. But even here they're recognizing that this is a day where I should try, even in my thoughts, to separate from the world, the things of the world for this day. To be set apart from that. Our works, words, and thoughts about their worldly employments and recreations, but also are taken up the whole time in the public and private exercises of His worship, the Lord's worship, and in the duties of necessity and mercy, like we just talked about. So in other words, what are they saying? Well, rest from our physical work, rest from our worldly business, rest from our words, rest from our thoughts that are about words, work and recreation, right? So, I mean, you know, how that breaks down, does that mean you shouldn't watch football on Sunday? I'm reading that, I'm saying, yeah, that's basically what that means. Now, again, this, I think, is one of those areas where it's a process. It's a process. And I think it's a matter of conviction, you know, as far as how you apply that, how you mandate that. I think it's something that we all have to look at, examine ourselves, and really ask ourselves, okay, what is the Lord teaching about the Sabbath? How do I please the Lord on the Sabbath? And what are the practical steps from there, right? And I think that would be one of them. My brother's a good example. I think I told y'all this story, but so when his wife was saved, and she went home and she told my brother, we got to find a good church to go to. He said, okay, as long as you find a church that gets out before 11 so I can watch football. And this was years ago, but then when the Lord saved him, one of the first things that went was football. He just did. He knew that was an idol in his life, you know. So I'm not saying everyone who watches football, that's an idol for him, but I'm saying, you know, a lot of times in our culture, it's very much the case, right? In a lot of scenarios. So that's one example of, you know, something I guess more obvious. Mowing the yard, I mean, things like that. You know, it's one of those things where it's like, that's where I think they're saying, listen, where they're saying ordering of their common affairs beforehand. Okay, I got 2 days off. I know Sunday's the Sabbath. I got to mow the yard. Let's do it on the other day I have off, right? Because, I mean, our culture's, in a sense, usually we have at least 2 days off, or 2 days. Not at least, but 2 days off. So that's where the Puritans are coming from, and I think they're using Scripture to justify that, and we'll close with some of this from Isaiah 58 in a minute. And then there's the other one I wanted to read. This is from the larger catechism, the Westminster Larger Catechism. This is the answer to question 117. And they ask the question, how is the Sabbath of the Lord's Day to be sanctified or set apart? Answer, the Sabbath of the Lord's Day is to be sanctified by a holy resting all the day, not only from such works as are at all times sinful, so in other words, not just resting from sinful works, but even from such worldly employments and recreations as are on other days lawful. And I think, here's the thing. John Bunyan was convicted. He called upon the name of the Lord because he was convicted that he was a Sabbath breaker. Right? That was the culture that he lived in. Now, here's the other thing. The Puritans, when they are writing this, and I think this can kind of set into motion just our culture has taken such a lax view of the Sabbath. I was reading something, and Voltaire said, everyone knows Voltaire, the atheist, notorious atheist in France, right? And he said, if we're going to destroy Christianity in France, we have to first destroy the Christian Sabbath. Because he realized once that begins to erode, everything else is going to become lax also, right? And this is the great difference, I think. Now, I would say that, yes, you can become legalistic about it. So I would prefer looking at it and saying, instead of pointing fingers and saying, oh, they're breaking the Sabbath, looking at our own selves and our own lives and trying to ask the Lord, how can we honor the Lord in the Sabbath? However, like the Puritans, they were dealing with, there was this order passed by one of the kings called the Book of Sports, which mandated, basically, and they had to read it from the pulpit, that, hey, the Sabbath is not a big deal. You guys can do whatever you want to, worldly recreations, worldly sports, worldly whatever. On the Sabbath is a day, for you to enjoy. I should have brought that out and just read it verbatim. But this was a huge rift, right? And so these Puritans were faced with the dilemma, do we read this and hold on to our pulpits in the flock, or do we say, no, we can't do this, we're not going to read this, and in doing so, we lose the pulpit, we lose the flock. They refused to read that. They were thrown into dungeons, they were thrown into prison, they were killed for it. So the point is that it's not a light issue if we look at it historically. It's a very serious situation, and it's a very important issue, right? Even though our culture is like, oh man, you're legalistic for even preaching on it. However, again, look at what Christ taught, okay? Here's the last thing I want to touch. Why is the Sabbath on Sunday and not Saturday? Right, that's the other question. Well, wait a minute. Why are we not doing everything in the Jewish tradition and everything they're doing, right? There's a few reasons for that. First of all, so the resurrection was on the Lord's Day, on the Sunday. The day of Pentecost took place on Sunday. John, in the book of Revelation, speaks about the Lord's Day, how he was caught up in the vision on the Lord's Day. Paul took offerings the first day of the week, where he's taking offerings. He says, put aside on the first day of every week, put aside something for the collection, and he's going to come by and get that. And that's the assumption that they were worshiping on the first day of the week. Secular historians even point out that Christians were always worshiping on the first day of the week. This is something that the church has always done since Christ was raised from the dead, basically. So there was always, it's not only all because we've always done it, but it is because of the biblical reasons that Christ, the first day of the week, is now the holy day, the Lord's Day, the Sabbath day, because of the resurrection. That was, and in fact it mentions this right here in the first part, the question I did not mention, or the section, chapter 21, number 7, which from the beginning of the world to the resurrection of Christ was the last day of the week, the Sabbath. From the beginning of the world to the resurrection of Christ was the last day of the week. The Sabbath was the last day of the week, the seventh day. And from the resurrection of Christ was changed into the first day of the week, which in Scripture is called the Lord's Day, and is to be continued to the end of the world as the Christian Sabbath. And you see the Scriptures there, and in fact some we've read today. But the point is this, okay? So we have this day, it's called Sunday. Now, I hope, what do we do with it? Well, we worship the Lord, we honor the Lord, we are amongst the saints, we put away worldly things, and we focus on the Lord. And if we do it right, is it not true that it'll draw us closer to the Lord? We need this day of rest. That's the whole point. We really do need this day of rest. And it goes back to what we read already in Isaiah 58. And as I'm turning there, and we'll close with this, but remember also in Numbers and this was always strange to me when I was first saved and I'm reading through the Bible. You come across this story in the book of Numbers where a guy, he's out there and he's picking up sticks on the Sabbath. And someone finds out about it and they go to Moses. They say, hey Moses, man, this guy was picking up sticks on the Sabbath. What should we do about it? Moses said, well, let me go ask God and then I'll get back to you. And y'all remember what God tells him? Stone him. And you're reading that, you're like, what? For picking up sticks on the Sabbath, God says stone him. And if you're looking at it through the lens of an unbeliever, or maybe even a new Christian where you still have all the baggage of this culture, you're looking at it and there's a part of you that says, that kind of seems unfair. But when you're looking at it through the perspective of how God is seeing this, that God is saying, I have deliberately and intentionally set this day apart so that my name is worshipped and that you will hear the word of God being preached. And that you, so in other words, it's for us. And to deliberately disobey that, that's why God comes down against it. Just like he would adultery, just like he would homosexuality, just like he would any of these other things. So when we see it, that this is something that God has always desired human beings from the very creation of the world to do, to set apart a day every single week where we worship the Lord and we're drawn closer to him through things like worship. Then until we realize that, I think there's an aspect of God's character that we miss. Now, Isaiah 58, we'll close with this. If because of the Sabbath you turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and I think that's the point, right? So in other words, it's not something begrudging. It's not, oh man, it's the Lord's day and I got to do all these things, right? But as Christians, we're saying, hey, this is a day where I get to set everything aside for the Lord. I just get to worship the Lord and dwell on the Lord and read the Word of God and be with God's people. The holy day of the Lord, honorable, and honor it, desisting from your own ways, from seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word. That's where the Westminster was coming from, by the way, right? When they're talking about words, thoughts, from seeking your own pleasure and speaking your own word, then you will take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So there's a blessing for us if we do this. And there is. I mean, how is it not a blessing when God's people deliberately put aside a day for the sake of God? We will be blessed for that. And we know how that is. When you're thinking, oh, I got a few hours, should I spend it like in the Word, or should I spend it doing something else? And your soul knows I should spend it in the Word, but then you go do something else. I don't know about y'all, but when I do that, you have that ghastly feeling inside. You're just sick, man. You're saying, oh man, I messed up. I should have done the other thing. Your soul is hungry now. Your soul's craving now. Well, when it comes to Sabbath, we can intentionally put everything aside. It happens one day every single week. So there's a reason for it. So by God's grace, let's honor the Lord on the Lord's day, on the Sabbath day. Remember, and especially remember, this is my favorite part, what He's brought us from, what He's delivered us from. I used to hate the Sabbath, right? I used to spend it for myself, but now it's so much better.